Eric was trying to speak Spanish to me before this episode began, and I didn't appreciate it because even though I am someone who, as they described on Instagram, that I look like I could be a cholo from the 1980s, I don't understand a single word you said to me.
I counted to 3 in Spanish.
Well,
it's high-level stuff.
That explains the confusion. I can't count to 3 in English, so I'm not sure it's a language barrier at this point.
Oh. Yeah, this isn't a linguistics thing. This is just, your level of
comprehension.
Intellect.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I thought it was interesting, Eric, how in this upcoming episode, we're actually going to expose Eric as someone who's not well-read. Fictional, I should say, because he does confuse Arthur Conan Doyle with Arthur C. Clarke. He said Arthur C. Clarke wrote Sherlock Holmes, which I don't know how I feel about that because my world's crumbling. My perception of you. You got a PhD, whatever, you read the scientific literature, but what type of human are you?
Listen, Arthur C. Doyle wrote This Sword in the Stone by Walt Disney as a co-author and editor. I'm pretty sure that's what we got out of that conversation that they're going to hear.
I just can't wait to see your collection of 50 Shades of Grey, like the entire anthology. Here we're talking about that's why at the start with you and Jake, I make reference to Dostoevsky and his book The Double, and of course Eric says he hasn't read it, and I'm just finding out so many things about you, and I don't know how I feel about this podcast. I know how I feel about you, but I just don't know how I feel about this podcast, Coach.
I have a very, very specific and limited reading list. I basically, since I was 10, I've read a sci-fi or fantasy book pretty much one per month.
Yep.
That's a lot of months now that I'm 36. I have read intensely on exercise science and nutrition.
Yep.
History of bodybuilding, and then philosophy-related books in my early 20s, but for a very brief window, mostly Eastern philosophy. And outside of that, pretty much illiterate. So
wow. Yeah, so besides 4 major fields of interest, completely illiterate. Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, I hope they will continue to listen to us. I can't count to 3 in Spanish or English. You haven't read a book that doesn't have a funny picture on the front or of a man holding a sword and or a laser beam rifle because you like sci-fi and fantasy.
Or a guy flexing. Like you said,
or a guy flexing
on the front. Yeah.
Omar. I also read books with guys flexing on the front, okay?
Correct.
Speaking of which, today is on disordered eating and on, body image. We talk about with someone who, it's Jake, how do you say the last name, Eric? It's
Linardon.
Who off camera, I said to Eric, is he from New Zealand? And you're like, man, he's Australian. And I'm now 0 for 2 so far.
Yep, just like you're American. He's New Zealandish.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, he did say, it's like, oh, you're from America. I'm like, I get that all the time. People, everyone in person, when I encounter people in Toronto, Eric, that are subscribers, they're like, you're visiting Toronto? I said, no, I live here. It's like, you're not from California? I'm like, no.
Yeah, they're like, hold on. I thought Canadians were like polite and
yes.
and like nicely spoken and respectful.
Gotcha. Okay.
Boom.
Boom,
as you guys say.
What's that about? We don't say it like that. Okay. Hey, Coach. Now that we've this is our required by our podcast producer, who doesn't exist. Our 3 to 4 minutes of banter to show that we are in fact friends, that we're sociable, that we
Correct.
like what we
It's
do.
in our contract.
And I'm looking at my timer. We just hit the 4-minute mark. Now we could get to the topic. That's how it works. So, Coach, tell us what's on tap today.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to not pretend to be your friend anymore and welcome Jake Linardon on the podcast.
Yep.
Because I would say, he's very humble. He'll say to the beginning of his career, but he is an incredibly productive researcher. If you were to go on PubMed and look up one of his studies and then look at all the ones that he has produced, he's putting out multiple studies like per every couple months, looking at the etiology of binge eating disorder, the differences between rigid and flexible restraint, and how sometimes they may not be that different, how tracking and monitoring behaviors impact people differently, whether they have an eating disorder or not. And he's someone who's also been active in the public sphere. He's got an Instagram that's active, a website, and he's trying to do the good work of educating people about binge eating and ways to treat it and move forward, and making people aware of media and the social media influence on the way we perceive ourselves. And most exciting is that I, and one of my students are working on a paper specifically about helping bodybuilders and bodybuilding coaches move towards more sustainable, healthy practices in the sport and their relationship with their body and nutrition. So he's going to be a name that you want to watch, because he's doing a lot of good work in this sector.
Interesting that you said the most fascinating part, or the coolest aspect, was the one that you're involved with. You listed many accomplishments, and you said perhaps most interesting is I am contributing with Jake. I mean, he's doing something, but this upcoming paper, it's a banger.
We really are past that 4-minute mark, aren't we?
You're like, roll the tape. No, these aren't my children. I don't have to love every single podcast equally. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, how he was able to talk on each topic, how actually both of you guys straight up were able to elucidate, as people will see, the audience, eating disorders as it relates to physical fitness, as it relates to iron enthusiasts, where we currently are with the understanding, what are some practical implications and takeaways, and also just straight up how prevalent in ways, because we talk about the role of media, social media in this modern age, and then the emergence also of maybe some of these aspects as it relates to males, which is not nearly talked about enough. You know, I see a lot of female fitness influencers talk about their eating disorders, body image issues. I have personally interacted with a lot of male fitness influencers who, from what I can tell, have some of these similar traits but are not vocal about it. So I think undercover there might be a brother out there listening to this, to some of the symptoms, like, oh, that kind of sounds like me. And just know that there are fantastic resources at the end, and that there's no shame in honestly vocalizing these things or seeking help for anything that we talk about in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I really hope people pay attention to this episode and realize its value and look inward, because unfortunately, while rates have been high and are still high among women with regard to body image and eating disorders and disordered patterns, they're steadily climbing, and I have some preliminary data that makes me think they're getting worse in men, especially in the bodybuilding and fitness community. So definitely take a listen, take it seriously, and hopefully there's some gems in here that can move you towards the best path for your life.
Let's get right into it, man. Wow. We have, has anyone here read Dostoevsky's The Double? Anyone?
I have not.
Okay, y'all should be ashamed of yourselves. Go ahead and read it when you can, but I'm looking at two individuals in front of me. I'm describing this for our audio-only podcast listeners that both have great hair, blue hoodies, white earbuds, dreamy blue-green eyes. The connection's not that good, but we're here in the flesh with two serious individuals, Coach Eric Helms, and we're joined by a special guest today, and we're going to get right down to it. Before we go on, I have one question, however, and that is there, Jake, a mastermind program I could sign up via you to finally get rid of binge eating? You know, I see them on Instagram where people without qualifications can just solve these problems through the power of positive encouragement. So I'm just wondering if we're going to talk about the science of disordered eating, how it applies to lifting. Is there like a handy clickable link people can use in the description just to pay you about $10,000 to finally cure themselves once and for all? It's kind of like, you know, various illnesses in times past where you just drink a magic potion and it goes away. Will we have that at the end? Yay or nay?
I'm not. I would be ill-advised to say that we have a magic potion. I think we have a bunch of different evidence-based techniques that we can use that would increase the likelihood of people getting better. But in terms of spitting out words that cure all, everyone will benefit, I don't think we do at the moment. But there are so many great resources out there that can increase the probability of people getting rid of these unhelpful behaviors. So I don't know if that's the
Okay.
answer that we want to hear.
Jake, I'm gonna have to stop. Eric, why do we have him on?
No, don't worry. I got a backup pitch. I prepared for this.
Okay.
So, Jake, option 2 is can we guarantee all our listeners that for the low price of sending us $199 directly to Eric Helms at 3D Muscle Journey PayPal, which of course we'll share a small percentage of profit with both Omar and Jake, that they will be certified binge eating prevention coaches with scope of practice to treat, diagnose, and cure binge eating by the end of this podcast.
Simple answer, yes. Do it now.
We're in. He's back in.
Do this.
All right.
Yeah.
You can stay on the podcast.
Hopefully
Jake.
I'll convince you.
Awesome. All right. So I just want to address our audience of future certified binge eating prevention specialists and just welcome them all to this certification course. And then be very clear that this is 100% a joke, and we are not looking to get sued by anyone in anywhere. So awesome. Jake, huge welcome to the podcast. I just want to introduce everyone to Dr. Jake Linardon. He is at Deakin University over in Melbourne, and he is just come as a storm through the city of PubMed, publishing left and right in the last couple of years, meta-analyses, retrospective analyses, looking at multivariate models to pick apart what is going on with binge eating. And someone I've had the pleasure of being on a podcast with. We met through a mutual friend, Jacob Skepis, those who aren't aware, JPS Health and Fitness, doing great things out in Melbourne. And Jake is an expert in binge eating, in the science behind it, dietary restraint. And we really want to have a fruitful discussion with him today regarding how that kind of impacts the sector of lifting. So, Jake, do a second and give us a solid on who you are, what you're about, and what your expertise is.
Yeah, and thanks for the introduction, Eric. That is very nice of you. And I just wanted to first just say thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this kind of stuff with you guys who are prolific in your own field as well. So it's a real nice honor to be able to talk about these things with you. So just a brief background. So as Eric mentioned, I'm currently working out of Melbourne, a university in Melbourne called Deakin, where I am a research fellow at the moment. And also I do a bit of lecturing as well in psychology. But my main kind of career focus is on conducting research, and particularly on binge eating type disorders, where I'm looking at a couple of kind of streams of research. One being understanding the things that are kind of promoting or encouraging binge eating, or what are the things that are maintaining it. And then also trying to come up with intervention approaches to help people overcome these binge eating tendencies, with a particular kind of interest in the past year or so on technology. So what role technology would play on eating disorders. So how can we essentially capitalize on smartphones, for example, or on the internet, and deliver kind of treatments and evidence-based strategies via these mediums to help people, because we know that there are so many people in the world that have binge eating issues, but there are only so many trained therapists out there to help people. So how can we reduce this gap? Well, the obvious answer is maybe we can use like phones and computers and stuff like that. And if we're able to deliver interventions via these technology-based platforms, then so many more people will be able to benefit. So that's really kind of occupying my time at the moment, trying to come up with, programs via the internet and via smartphones. And yeah, as Eric said, I've got quite a bit of experience on kind of evaluating the evidence base for our current treatments for binge eating. So via conducting a series of meta-analyses. So ultimately, yeah, I'm in the very early stages of my career. I'm only a year and a half out of the PhD. But it's exciting times to come, and trying to broaden kind of the network of reach by doing these podcasts and just kind of spreading awareness of some things people can implement to, I guess, help them to some extent.
Love it. So I think what would be really useful to start is to understand probably the mechanisms behind some of these eating disorders. Like when we look at why they occur from a research standpoint, what are some of the underlying causes, or at least maybe increased risk factors that would predispose someone to being likely to develop eating disorders, and which ones?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And when we're talking about, I think it might be important to differentiate between causal factors and risk factors, because if we're trying to talk about something that causes something else, we need an experiment to be able to manipulate it. And if we're talking about, so for example, if we're talking about child abuse, which is a known risk factor for eating disorders, as researchers, we can't, I guess, assign people to an abuse condition and a non-abuse condition. So a lot of the time, I think the reason why it might be important to differentiate between these two is because there are a lot of people out there that talk about eating disorders are caused by this, when in actual fact they're not caused by it, because we haven't been able to conduct an experiment on it. So as you mentioned, Eric, kind of talking about risk factors instead, which are more correlational in nature. But we know there's heaps of research done on risk factors for eating disorders, and unfortunately the answer is, with every kind of psychiatric or physical illness, that there's no single cause. It results from the interplay of genetics, psychology, social, and things like that. But we do know that there are some clear risk factors that we have for eating disorders, and the risk factors are quite the same across the disorders as well. So they're not unique to anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. And we know a couple of the major risk factors are, one, body image problems. So people who have body dissatisfaction, so they're generally unhappy with their body weight or their body shape. And the reason why that puts someone at risk for a disorder of binge eating is because it increases the susceptibility to engage in one of those really rigid and inflexible dieting strategies. And as well, it kind of leads to a depressed kind of mood. And those are also clear risk factors for the binge eating type disorders too. But if you want to take a step back and look like, well, why do people get unhappy with their body? There are a couple of things that we know that are causing or increasing the risk of body dissatisfaction. And that's kind of the media. The media portrayals of what men and women should look like. So nowadays we've got what men should look like. This all year round, they should have this extremely muscular physique, and then because people aren't really aware that if Eric, that you look like that at the moment because you're competing, from my understanding, that it's impossible to kind of sustain all year round, isn't it? Because you have to kind of restrict your food for so long. But people are a bit unaware of that.
I've seen Eric in person and he looks great year round, so I don't know if that's the best example.
That was definitely not meant to say that you didn't look great.
You talk shit about my coach one more time and we're gonna have issues.
That might have come out wrong, eh?
Omar is loyal to a fault, even lying about what I look like. But I.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, so the idea of what men and women should look like, and then people take that on, or they internalize it, and then that internalization of the thin or the muscular ideal makes people quite unhappy with their body image. And then when they're unhappy with their body image, they try to find ways to change their body, and the way in which they try to change that is via these dietary practices, but not the quote unquote safe dietary practices, the more harmful ones as well. So the idea of these extremely rigid rules that people have, and we know that these rules are so difficult to sustain over a long period of time. What happens is people end up breaking these rules because they have a million of them. If they break one of them, then all hell breaks loose, and then they interpret that as that they're not good enough, they're a failure, and they failed their self-control, and then that increases the susceptibility of binge eating type behavior. And if that goes on for long enough, then they would be classified as having a particular eating disorder, either whether they compensate after that, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. So in a nutshell, so many different causes. They range from harmful dietary practices, body image disturbances, mass media, and there's also a whole host of genetic components as well that also interact with these things to place people at risk for an eating disorder.
That's a lot to unpack there, and that's really helpful. I think to tie this into bodybuilding, one of the first things I think I want to emphasize is that it seems like the fact that a certain look is idealized is at the root cause of this. Because if we put a certain look on a pedestal, or it being the ideal, then it can supplant self-worth or become a component, probably a primary component or too large of a component, if you will, for one's self-worth. And then would you say that the way and the way that someone identifies with restraint and implements it is then kind of a property of that? Because if that has an extreme emotional attachment for them and has a lot of value, then they're willing to do extreme things to achieve it, rather than say, if this is some kind of goal that is more or less just has its general purpose, it's not deeply attached to my own self-worth and value, I might just try to figure out what's the best way to do it, what makes sense, and have a little more emotional distance. So would you say that the way someone enacts dietary restraint is kind of almost a property of their body image and what they see as ideal?
Yes, and you couldn't have put it. I couldn't have put it better myself. In terms of that's what what we think about eating disorders and what are the things that are maintaining it. So just to quickly differentiate between something that puts people at risk versus something that's maintaining. Putting people at risk is a variable that kind of is associated with the onset of an illness, whereas something that's maintaining it is a variable that's keeping it going. And Eric, what you've described there is the things that are kind of keeping it going, and at the crux of kind of these binge eating type issues is this what we call an over-evaluation of body weight and shape, which is perfectly suited to the bodybuilding population, because what that means is people place their self-worth almost entirely on what they look and what they weigh. So whereas most people in general daily life evaluate who they are as a person on many different life domains. So things like, how well they're doing with their friends, their spouse, their school, their education, their work. People with kind of binge eating type problems almost exclusively focus on their shape and weight. So their whole self-worth is dictated just by this domain of shape and weight. And which is kind of, I'm sure it rings bells in your ears in terms of what you see through your clients, because they're focusing so heavily on their body weight and shape for a competition or something like that. And then that we know through a bunch of different studies that over-evaluation of body weight and shape promotes or encourages, or even to some extent causes people to develop these really inflexible weight control behaviors. So you're right in terms of these really harmful dietary behaviors can be understood to stem directly from that crux of over-evaluation of weight and shape. So they're the two things that are mainly keeping those binge eating type problems from going. So the idea is we want to try to modify, if we want to help people with these issues, regardless of what domain, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of whether they're bodybuilders or just people from the general population, we want to try to minimize those things from happening. We want to try to broaden a person's sense of self-worth, so not place so much emphasis on their shape and weight, but in the context of your sport, really talk about, emphasizing just as an example, emphasizing the importance of, beating their rep range or increasing the weight on the bar or something like that, something to give them more self-worth on. And we also want to make sure that we don't prescribe these really inflexible diet rules. So some of the things I couldn't imagine some of the things that you've heard. So I'd love to hear some examples, but I've heard some things where people just don't eat carbohydrates after 6 p.m. For some reason, 6 p.m. is the magic number or the magic time, and then there's no carbohydrates consumed after that. So they're kind of really hard rules to follow because a lot of the times people crave them. But Yes, they're the two key things that are driving these problem eating behaviors.
Right. I think, the rules are really interesting because if you have a healthy sense of self-worth, and bodybuilding for you is not about fixing something that's wrong with you or becoming something right finally because you've always been, too skinny, too small, or too fat, or whatever judgment you lie upon yourself, the rules are much more easy to change, as in my experience as a coach, than if they are stemming from this emotional lack of self-worth and looking to bodybuilding for it, which makes sense, right? Like if someone is just going, oh, what's the best way to do it? And they kind of got a bro science or old school traditional approach, or probably got it handed down from someone who does have a lot of emphasis on their self-worth based on their bodybuilding, then the importance of those rules and how many there are and the rigidness of them is going to have almost this kind of idealized religious aspect where I can't let go of them. I've got to pray for the sun to come up. How do I know? Well, every time I pray, the sun comes up, so I'm not going to change. Okay, don't screw this up for me. But on the other hand, if someone has a relationship with bodybuilding where it is an adjunct to their life, I find that the rules will shift so long as they are convinced and they see the evidence and it makes sense logically. And that's so much easier to coach someone. So in my mind, if I was to put on my sociologist hat, which I do keep around in instances like this, it really makes sense to me that we have a bit of an onus on us in the bodybuilding community to represent ourselves and represent our sport in a certain way. And this is where I think we can tie in the history and the culture. And Omar, I'd love to get your perspective on this, where when bodybuilding first cropped up in the 1800s, late 1800s, very late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way through the 1930s and 40s, there was always this assumption that, your form followed function, and people weren't often training specifically for bodybuilding. They would be physical culturists, quote unquote. And they, like, for example, the gentleman who won the 1901 great competition, the first large scale bodybuilding competition, he was a multi-sport athlete who did some weight training, but didn't train for that competition. Yeah. And they were like, hey, this is great. We like the way this guy looks. He didn't look like the classic bodybuilder. There was more variation between the physiques on stage. And then over time, as the removal of the athletic side of it, as form for form's sake, and as I would say the artistic element went away from the sport, it became more about just you objectified, which I think started to lead to this. The first judges in that great competition were two gentlemen. You might have heard of the author of the Sherlock Holmes series, who Arthur C. Clarke, is that right?
Or is this Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? It's one of those.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. Wrong Arthur. Yeah. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That'll Arthur C. Clarke, definitely wrong. That's a sci-fi author. And also a local sculptor who was also an athlete. And then the tiebreaker would be Eugen Sandow, who was the father of bodybuilding, if you will. So they had these two elements that I think were really important. Is one, form was intrinsically linked to athletic function and being physical and seeing it as a representation of your health and athleticism. And then two, it had an artistic quality. And the thing about art is that there's this underlying assumption that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You might appreciate abstract art, you might appreciate classical art, etc. You might appreciate different mediums, and that's very different from saying I'm going to create art with my body versus saying this is the way men should look, this is the way women should look if they want to be attractive, valued, have a mate, and be successful in life, which I think is the current messaging that is sometimes explicit. Or implicit, where you might have a bodybuilder who's standing in front of a Lamborghini with a hot chick on his arm. And I think that's really where we need to bear a lot more responsibility. If we're marketing ourselves as putting ourselves on a pedestal as just being successful in life in general, versus saying, hey, this is the equivalent to me shooting a three-pointer in basketball, or this is an artistic expression and celebrating the body in that way. I think that's so subtle, but so incredibly important, and it's part of the reason why we have, and correct me if I'm wrong, growing rates of some of these eating disorders in society. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is 100% accurate, and it just comes back to it all kind of stems from the message that we're putting out to younger people, in that this is what men and this is what women should look like. So what we need to do is challenge. We need to challenge that kind of message, or change the message, that because when people take on or internalize this message, they don't know what you've gone through, for example, to try to look the way you are for a particular show. They don't know that it's not an easy ride. Like, there are going to be some complications that are associated with that. But because we see kind of the final product, people think that is attainable, and definitely attainable, and for a long period of time, all of the time. So as a result, people get really unhappy if they're not able to achieve that in a short period of time, because they're not aware or educated about the processes involved in the physique change or whatnot. So it all stems down to not only does the message need to shift a little bit, that it's not being a particular physique does not necessarily mean you're going to be successful, happy, rich, and all that in life. And the second process is, well, you need to be aware of the safe ways in which you could get to that for a very short period of time, because you're doing it for a purpose. Your purpose is to compete in a sport. But oftentimes when we see social media and things like that, people glorify it to an extent that if you achieve this, then all of these other things will come with it, all these positive things. So it's just kind of a little bit of a misconception, I guess, when we're talking about what the idealized figure is. And there shouldn't probably be an idealized figure, because we should kind of, recognize the diversity of all different body shapes, weights, and things like that. But yes, it just boils down to the message that we need to kind of change around that, as you kind of mentioned there.
Well said.
Yeah. Jake, I have a question for you in terms of whether or not there's been any historical research taking a look at the role of media and in terms of influencing what the idealized version of the male body, the female body would be, because myself and Eric, part of the origin of iron culture has been taking a look at the early beginnings of Western iron culture. So as Eric said, first bodybuilding show in the late 1800s, taking a look then into the transition with guys like Eugene and some of the promoters, Bernard McFadden. And at that start, I don't want to make a counter argument, but I think it's interesting when Eric made the point that we have, as coaches, as bodybuilding enthusiasts, a responsibility to promote a healthier image or a more holistic picture. And to me, it almost represents, Eric, a renaissance of that which started iron culture. Honestly, when you take a look at it in the late 1800s, where Eric said form follows function, the won the first competition did multiple sports, but then also did a little bit of resistance training. And even when you look at how they judged bodybuilding in quotations, it wasn't just the physique. It wasn't on only, max muscularity. There are other components. They actually judged hair quality, skin quality, a lot of different components. Just a person that seemed healthy, vigorous, a positive correlation between what we would call health. So, having vigor and vitality, and then also what their body can do. So multiple components, as you're kind of saying, as opposed to how you look, bro, how big are your biceps, that it's kind of distilled down to in this modern day. And when I say the Renaissance, I'll give a shout out to 3DMJ for raising awareness amongst the natural lifting community, the role of strength in terms of hypertrophy, but then also as another component through which people could try and attain a better version of themselves, where kind of, as you said, if we're just taking a look at the physical aspect and not other markers, how you're progressing in the gym or how you feel about yourself, it could lead down this dark path. So I'm just curious the role of media, because I had a conversation, we had a previous episode on this, where I was speaking with an individual who, he flat out just said, and Eric and I talked about it on the episode, where he said he thinks bodybuilding is unhealthy fundamentally. And we're just talking about the idea that media probably played a big role. If we look at 100 years ago, what the goals were and how people regarded themselves, or what the intention was, or what the idealized form, if there was any, and how important that was towards your self-worth. I just wonder how it's changed over time, because I've seen even amongst ourselves over the last 10, 15 years, there was this interesting trend amongst professional bodybuilding, let's say from the early 1900s to the mid 1950s, 60s. So the Bronze Age, Silver Age, Golden Age, then the Modern Age. So where they got bigger and bigger, the X frame, and then now they're introducing things like classic physique, or then they have physique. Natural bodybuilding's getting more of a shout out. There's more components. Can you just comment on any of the research when it comes to the changing idealized physique or body, both for males and females, and maybe what some of those influences or what some of those factors have been?
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we know that the media play a huge role towards the onset and maintenance of all these eating problems. So the picture looks a little bit different across sex. So for females, for example, it dates back to the early 80s, where there's done a whole host of research on the impact of the media on body image problems, body dissatisfaction, and also eating problems. So over time, what we've seen is towards the early 80s, there was a strong emphasis on a really a thin kind of figure, which is kind of stabilized over the course of the 90s and then the early 2000s. And even so for example, there was research done in I think it was the early 90s, where they looked at all of children cartoon shows, for example, and they kind of coded the cartoon shows, and they show that the characters that were the female characters that were really thin were associated with more positive personality traits. They were liked more, and they were just viewed much more favorably, and that occupied about 80% of the main character of all these children's shows in the early 90s. About 90% of the shows were a really thin figure, which is what was kind of idealized. And by contrast, when they showed overweight characters, they were associated with the opposite personality traits as well. So they were associated with, they were viewed as greedy, nasty, and all these other problematic personality traits that people have. And then they did another analysis of this in 2010, which was only 9 years ago. And the same thing still emerged. So roughly the same percentage still emerged, in that thin kind of figures were viewed with positive personality traits, and obese or overweight figures were viewed as negative personality traits. So that's just highlighting that not much has changed over the course of 20 or so years. But I think in more recent times, I do think that there is a little bit this is just my personal opinion, though. I don't know if there's any research on this. I do think it has shifted a little bit, maybe a little bit, just because I'm more aware of kind of these kind of fat acceptance movements that people kind of promote nowadays. And I think it's more common for people to really spruik up or highlight the body positivity and the fat acceptance and things like that. But again, that's just my personal opinion. That I don't know of any research that's been done to kind of clarify what's happening here and now. But in terms of the research over time, it's shown that thin characters are overrepresented in cartoon and in films and in and TV shows, whereas overweight characters are underrepresented. And when they are represented, they're viewed less favorably. For men, and then we know that that's got a direct causal link. So we're able to perform experiments on the impact of media on body image problems and eating problems. And we know that that's got a causal link on body image problems. So people who are just exposed to these cartoons or these shows are more likely to engage in these problems than people who aren't exposed to them. But then the picture is a little bit different from men. More so in recent times, the idealized figure of men has become this muscular ideal. So it hasn't been portrayed so much in the media in the earlier times. So in the 90s and the 80s, we've just seen a spike of this going on in the past decade or so, where
Marvel movies.
message. Sorry.
More like Marvel movies. Now comics are mainstream.
Exactly.
Superheroes, yeah.
Yeah, so we've seen a massive spike in what men should look like now, and there was even a nice illustration of this where they compared a Luke Skywalker figure
Yes.
in the
I've seen this, yeah.
90s, and then they looked at what the figure looks like nowadays, and the change is huge. So now Luke Skywalker is buff. He's got a V. The shoulders are humongous. He just looks like the perfect man. Whereas back in the day, the figurine of Luke Skywalker, he was this kind of scrawny little guy who was just walking around. And that's just an excellent portrayal of how things have shifted over time. So what men should be, and that directly impacts how men view their body and how they equate their body. So we've got all of these messages bombarding us, and we imagine, we put ourselves in the shoes of a young teenage boy. They're seeing all these things of, if you look like this, you will be attractive. All the women will want you. You'll have all the wealth and riches. That's kind of the message that we're getting. So
You'll be the hero.
You'll be the hero. And it's understandable that men now go, I want to do this. This is how I want to do. So how do I achieve this? Well, then they'll just do a simple Google search and they'll get to some, Insta famous bro science person where they'll say this bro science person will say to them, don't eat carbs, mate. If you do, it's the devil. Like if you eat carbohydrates, you will not achieve this goal. So then this consumer then says to themselves, well, I'm not going to eat carbs because this is what it's going to, it's going to be a problem. It won't allow me to achieve my goal. And then that's where the issue starts. So it's just a whole multitude of things that are going on. And then we can directly link it back to the message that is being sent via these bunch of media platforms and stuff. So to answer your question, Omar, there's direct links between media consumption causing these bunch of different issues that we see. So I think spreading the more scientific, although it's probably the more boring method, spreading the truth in terms of that there are no good or bad foods, quote unquote, will go a long way to kind of mitigating these issues that we're seeing.
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to challenge you both a little bit here, because I think the scientific approaches to bodybuilding and improving the methods and maybe even taking a more holistic scientific approach where we go, right, maybe we should compete naturally, maybe we should use a more flexible dieting approach, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's treating the symptom. Like I think you said, Jake, that the seed gets planted in society through the media. And then I'll also challenge you, Omar, in that I don't think we can put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to the goal of competitive bodybuilding. I think being within the guidelines of the sport, most muscular, the leanest, best peaked, et cetera, all that, I think to whatever objective standard there is, which is going to be inherently subjective, so it'll change, people are going to try to maximize that because it's competitive. But I do think if we go all the way back to that, and not to say that you can't improve outcomes and have people have a better relationship and more sustainable performance using these methods, because there isn't, as much as people will sometimes separate them, a huge separation between function and form. If you are inherently unhealthy, you can look at having a shorter career. So for example, in the back of there's an appendix in John Fair's History of the Mr. America, where he looks at the ages of when Mr. America's died. And you can see it's in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all the way through the 50s and 60s. And then guys start dying in their 40s, 50s, much more frequently around the time that anabolic steroids come out, around the time that the standard is also higher, and you see people doing more extreme things. Now, you could definitely sell the message saying, hey, you can have a competitive career into your 60s doing what you love if you do it this way, and you can still get good results. But the underlying beliefs and affect on one's personal self-worth is still coming from the media or the messaging. And in my mind, I think it's therefore critically important that we talk about why we're doing it. And it's how you do it, I think, has to come second. And so I guess where my challenge is that, Omar, I don't think Here's an example. So if it was just the methods and how extreme it was and what was attainable and what was sustainable, we would see less issues in men's physique competitors and bikini competitors. And it would be a good thing that now there's these new divisions that are less extreme. You don't have to get as lean, something that's more attainable for everyone. But actually, in contrast, what I've seen, and there is some limited data to back this up, is that among bikini competitors and men's physique competitors is when I see the most amount of disordered eating and some of the unhealthiest practices. There was a recent study by Lindsay and colleagues, came out in 2019, where 5 of the 16 competitors, these are men's physique, and if you look at their lean body mass, they're certainly not like juiced out of their minds, if you will. They very well could be taking anabolics, but it's not to the point where they're like 120 kilos at 5'8". And 5 of the 16 of them, that's 31%, previously had an eating disorder. 4 had been diagnosed with binge eating disorder, and 1 had muscle dysmorphia. So that's like 100 times the actual average among males, I think, from the 90s. If not higher, might be 1,000 if I got my decimal place wrong. But it's an incredibly high percentage, and that kind of mirrors that observation I have. And I think what's happening is that promotion of the physique as a way to become successful or a good person or a better person, or just idealizing it like this is an improvement on you if you look like a bodybuilder, I think that then becoming more mainstream is probably not beneficial. And if it was just the methods, or if it was just how sustainable or maintainable it was, you would think that these less extreme physiological conditions you had to achieve would be better for one's relationship with food. But if anything, it's not that. And I think it's because it overlaps with what society is already telling people.
Yes.
You want to look good in bikini? Well, that's already the message you're getting as a woman. You want to look like a men's fitness model and look great on the beach? That's already what society's telling you. But there's no one in society saying, hey, lady, you know what you need? Delt veins. And hey, dude, you know what you need? You need to have your butt so lean it looks like a rib cage. That's what everybody wants, So it's interesting to me that when bodybuilding was a counterculture and it was a niche, it was kind of viewed as that's weird and that's cool. It's kind of like a circus freaky thing. And bodybuilding's always tried to become more mainstream. And when it has, that's when I think it's potentially influenced society in a negative way. So I guess I don't think bodybuilding is the root of the problem. It's more like media and our society is. Yeah, because bodybuilding is so tiny. But I do think that when bodybuilding gets the opportunity to come to the limelight, we need to be very clear that what we're about and separate competitive bodybuilding from what I would call physical culture and bettering your life through lifting weights and moderation in your nutrition. So that's my rant for this podcast, and I definitely won't do it again in 5 minutes.
Well, it's Jake, you want to go first, or I yeah, good, okay. You're gonna come at me on my own damn podcast like that, challenging me. Well, guess what, Coach? I agree with everything that you just said
too.
Because my whole point throughout the last 2 dozen episodes, has been nudging you to raise, as they said in Dune, the Butlerian Jihad to eliminate all thinking machines, or like in Carpenter's They Live movie, to destroy the media that pollutes our population. I've just been silently throwing little references in every single episode, and to hear you not only echo, it's your own original thoughts that it's so much larger than bodybuilding, brother. I'm right. I'm ready with a hammer. Okay, I'm ready like Jesus at the temple to turn out them moneylenders. I'm ready because I honestly, what you said, to be serious for a second now, about it being so much beyond bodybuilding. I think bodybuilding is just a symptom of the role that media and the role of marketing, I would say, when you can commercialize something. And that's, I don't even know how you'd study this because there's so many variables at play. But from reading some of the histories and seeing what's been going on, the more commercial the endeavor got, the less pure, obviously, the intention. And when you have financial considerations influencing certain things in the role of, let's say, bodybuilding shows where we talk about the hero's journey, right? Let's say of Luke Skywalker, so Joseph Campbell, and all those cats talking about the hero's journey that Luke must undergo in order to be the person that he wants to be, and how do we represent that then in an action figure as opposed to, you know, some sort of spiritual awakening or emotional journey. He just got more jacked, right? It's like, let's make the action figure more jacked. And so the emphasis on, I think, the superficial at by and large, and that's why I don't know what the research shows either, Eric, but I'd be curious how it's different across cultures, because you made a post that was very interesting. The Indian bodybuilders from the 30s.
Yeah, there's a book published in 1930 with some physical culturists, bodybuilders in a certain part of India. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's why when you were referencing, Jake, before, the body image from the 1980s now through the last, 10 years, last 5 years, so basically the last 3 decades, I was thinking to myself, because sometimes I go to the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and I look at some of the paintings, and I think to myself, wow, I must have taken a lot of work. F that, let's get a cheeseburger. But if you take a look at even the physiques, the idealized female figure, right, which we don't have, you can't survey these people. We only have some of the art, some of the writings to go on, and how it's changed, where they're by today's standards, these women were more plump. And that was seen, and it depends upon where you go. And in fact, when I was doing just a little bit of research, I think it was around the 1800s where the portly fellow became a popular archetype, because it's an industrialist, one who possesses wealth and has the ability then to feed himself, so much so that he's a wealthy
guy on the Monopoly cover,
right? So just the changing trends, and then how now we know, and unfortunately, Eric, I think we see the echo of that which marketers have known for a long time, where we could think, and Jake, you said kind of the same thing about, I like to think of myself as an Instagram historian, where we see on Instagram some of these individuals following that pattern. And I don't know who it was, Eric. We had a guest on that is Malcolm Gladwell. Oh, it was Andy Galpin. The 7 steps, essentially, of selling anything, but how you appeal to the emotion. And so how the fundamental shift has occurred when it comes to the body. Once we can, sexualize it, once we can market it, once we could profit off of it, and we could pry upon these insecurities, the advancement of certain idealized types, and then the pressure to fit into that, I think, has only increased. So I agree. It actually is a very cool thing you said when you said bodybuilding, and I'm always about the counterculture, punk through and through. We said bodybuilding almost was, at the time, like 1904, even 1974, when Arnold stepped on stage at that art gallery to raise money for Pumping Iron.
Yeah. All the way through Pumping Iron. Pumping Iron was definitely a counterculture in indie film.
Yeah. Yep. And now the responsibility placed upon iron enthusiasts, like all 3 of us right here, to promote the right image, because now that bodybuilding is getting a little bit more play, the role that it places in society and what it should be about, I think, becomes even more important. So, Coach, you came at me, and I opened my arms wide open.
I love it.
Cue the Creed song.
And we slowly ran towards each other on the beach and hugged. I'm so happy.
Yep. Jake, you want to join on this hug?
Give me a hug.
Come on in, brother.
To echo your point, Eric, yeah, I 100% agree, because what you said reminded me of a particular research study or a trial that was done a while ago, where you said if you were targeting the expressions of this, so the real problematic restraint and stuff like that, we're just targeting this. I think your words were the symptom rather than the root or something like that, which is exactly true. So there was a research paper done a while ago where they looked at who was going to relapse following particular treatments for binge eating. So they were trying to track what are the types of people that then go on to relapse later on. So then they found was they found that people who went through treatment but they weren't able to change their conflation of self-worth with body image. So their shape and weight, where they overvalue their weight and shape, which we know is directly linked or occurs as a result of the messages, the mass media messages. When people weren't able to change that, when they just targeted the superficial stuff, quote unquote, those were the people that were more likely to relapse down the track, because it directly comes back to your point is if you target just the symptoms or the expressions, that's not enough. Because then people won't be able to people will just go back to their old ways, because we're not getting to the root kind of entrenched thoughts, belief systems that people have. And if we're not getting to that, then people aren't likely to get a benefit from sustained change. And just that kind of research paper immediately came to my mind when you said that, because it's true. We need to go back to the very start, or the thing that is kind of driving everything else, in order for people to adopt more healthier eating patterns and more healthier body image, and the way that they kind of view themselves as well. So yeah, it was an interesting point that you made, and I think that's the way to go forwards if we're able to kind of help people with these particular types of issues, or kind of change the paradigm of your sport and the way in which people should go about doing it.
So what I got from that is that no matter whatever I say is evidence-based. I am science. That's what I got from that. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that.
You are science.
You are science. You're the avatar of science. Whatever you say cannot be wrong. It's like when Neil deGrasse Tyson basically said that philosophy is a useless endeavor, and no one in the audience was like, "What?" It's like, "Oh, it's Neil. Neil's science. How can he be wrong?"
Neil has to be right, even though philosophy is the root of empiricism. But that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
That's okay. So that was I really enjoyed that discussion. I think now we've gotten to kind of the seed of some of these problems that people deal with. I think one important nuance is, are eating disorders and body image disorders considered separate these days, or where are they? How do they interplay? And when they're looked at and diagnosed, are they under the same umbrella?
No, they're not actually. They're not under the same umbrella. So body image disorders are relatively new. They haven't got a whole lot of attention just yet. And the common ones I can think of are body dysmorphic disorder, and muscle dysphoria is coming in, but it's not, from my understanding, it's not a clinical diagnosis that someone could receive. We just know that there's a lot of attention going on. Eating disorders are the more established, and from my memory, I may be corrected here, but from memory, the body image disorders that we have at the moment do not actually fall under the eating disorder category, or the eating disorder chapter per se in the DSM. They actually fall under the anxiety disorders, so the OCD type disorders. Because if we have a look at body dysmorphia, or people they think that they've got something wrong with their body, to not your everyday person. They really think that, they genuinely think that something is wrong with their body, and they go to great lengths to hide it. So they engage in a bunch of ritualistic behaviors that people would see, which is common with the OCD type disorder. So that obsessive compulsive disorder, so the hand washing and things like that. So it's actually categorized under the anxiety umbrella, the body image disorders, whereas eating disorders are under their own separate umbrella of themselves. So, but within the eating disorders, we know that there are a bunch of different subtypes as well. So there's bulimia nervosa, anorexia, binge eating disorder, and whatnot. So I haven't done much work on body image disorders per se, but all I do know is that they're in their real infancy at the moment. So we really we don't know much about body image disorders just yet. And the only reason is because no one's spent a lot of time on them. I'm sure that there are people out there that devote their life to it, but compared to all of the other psychiatric disorders that we see, we just don't know much about it. We know that there are some similarities between body dysmorphic disorder and anorexia nervosa, that they're more similar than they are different. But to the extent of knowing, to the extent of our knowledge of eating disorders, body image disorders are just a long way away, and it's just a matter of devoting more time and looking at it as well. Looking at what are kind of the core characteristics, and what are the treatment options, the maintaining mechanisms, and all of those things.
Right. I ask because it's interesting that it seems like the general consensus in the eating disorder research is that the root cause might be an over-evaluation of self, shape and weight, and a maybe not necessarily an unrealistic view of one's body, but at least an over-importance on its value. So it's almost like the eating disorder is an emergent property of how one views their body and the importance they put on it. So maybe we're catching things a little late when we emphasize the treatment of some of these eating disorders. But it would be interesting just to see how that changes in the next 10 years. So let's talk about the different eating disorders there are. You identified 3. Kind of what their hallmark characteristics are, and what are the treatment options for someone? What's the most effective strategies we have? And then I think from there we can start talking about restraint, which would be cool.
Yeah. So in terms of the eating disorders, so that we know that the 3 main ones are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. So anorexia nervosa, the really thin figure, people restrict their food intake and they don't understand the seriousness of the disorder. And it's that kind of stereotypical illness that we see in kind of mass media of what people with an eating disorder look like. Binge eating disorder is a little bit different in that it's characterized by recurrent episodes of binge eating, but people don't usually compensate after the binge eating episodes. And that explains why a huge percentage of people with binge eating disorder are kind of overweight or obese, because they're consuming heaps of calories but not then getting rid of it. And people with binge eating disorder, a lot of the time they don't practice dietary restraint. They eat kind of they consistently overeat, but then they also binge eat as well. So they're just consuming a whole bunch of calories, but not kind of exercising or not compensating in a way to get rid of those calories, which can explain the overweight and obese comorbidities. And bulimia nervosa is very similar to binge eating disorder, but people do compensate. So they, do things like they self-induce vomit, they exercise excessively, they take laxatives and stuff like that. But the interesting idea is that there's kind of a push to view eating disorders to not separate the 3 of them, or not separate all the eating disorders, more so taking a trans diagnostic perspective, which just means that we view eating disorders as one disorder, and then it doesn't really matter what the type of eating disorder is. And it comes back to your point, Eric, in that the reason that is we're kind of trying to think that way at the moment is because of the root kind of cause, that over-evaluation of body weight and shape. We see that over-evaluation is prominent in all of the eating disorders. So if that's kind of the root cause, then our treatments should be developed in a way that tackles that root cause. And because of that, even though that there's some different behavioral expressions, so that those kind of symptomatic things, the root cause is considered to be the same. And as a result, we should just view an eating disorder as an eating disorder and not separate between all of the different types. Because people argue that we're just trying to overcomplicate things if we're trying to disentangle between 5 different subtypes. We should just consider it as one eating disorder, know that the root cause is this, and then as a result, do our best to target that root cause by a bunch of different strategies there. So they're kind of it's kind of a debate in the literature at the moment. But in terms of how we should treat it, our best approaches are actually not that great at the moment, unfortunately. But our best approach at the moment is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is essentially, the aim of it is to normalize people's eating behavior. So take a more flexible approach to kind of eating without emphasizing the weight and shape stuff. And we also want to challenge people's beliefs about their body weight and shape. So really trying to devote time to that root kind of over-evaluation, do our best we can to modify that. And CBT it's got the best evidence base at the moment. So for bulimia nervosa, only about 35% of people who receive CBT fully recover. So there's still around 65% that are still symptomatic, which is not great. And for binge eating disorder, people who receive CBT, around 50% are expected to fully recover. Again, there's still 50% that are not benefiting fully from the treatment. So it just highlights that we've got our best approaches, but they're not actually that great when we look at it. There's still a lot more to be done towards tackling these issues of binge eating.
Right. That's. I think there's a couple interesting things there, and why I think it's probably good that there is an ongoing controversy and lack of consensus on whether or not all eating disorders should be viewed as one or not. Because if there are different success rates, that might indicate that it's not a completely unifying planted seed. You know, for example, it makes sense to me that bulimia has a lower success rate than binge eating disorder, because you could imagine that someone who has binge eating disorder is using it purely as a coping strategy. They have a relationship with food that has an emotional element, but maybe not necessarily are they doing it to change their body. And they just have this more behavioral conditioned response, which would be perfect for CBT, you know?
Yeah.
And while someone who is then trying to compensate and make up for it is going, oh crap, they're thinking about the result of binge eating. This is going to make me overweight. I don't want to be overweight because I have that core belief, and therefore maybe CBT is not quite as effective. And as we see, like 2/3 of people relapsing or not having an alleviation of symptoms. Is that an accurate characterization, would you say, or a hypothesis?
I think it is accurate, and what we see, as we mentioned, for one of the core things that are keeping the eating disorders going is this inflexible dietary restraint, because that's the expression from those body image problems. And people with binge eating disorder don't generally have that inflexible dietary restraint. So it's just one less thing that we need to kind of worry about, which then means that we see that binge eating, like you said, Eric, we know in binge eating disorder that the behavior is almost always directly a result of like negative mood, interpersonal problems. So they're using it as a coping strategy. So that's much more suited towards behavioral techniques, which, as you mentioned, bulimia nervosa is a more complicated illness. It's a more complicated disorder because it has a bunch of different cycles that people go through and that are much more entrenched. And even so, bulimia nervosa has a much earlier age of onset than binge eating disorder. People with bulimia nervosa usually get it in their mids to early adolescence, compared to binge eating disorder, which is in their more so, generally speaking, in early adulthood. So it's less. Bulimia nervosa is more entrenched, so it's much more difficult to kind of get to, and which can explain the lower recovery rates as well. So yes, that would then mean that, well, should we take this unified approach if they're so different in their age of onset or their illness duration and the things that are keeping it going? So yeah, I will definitely agree with that. And we still need to know much more. We still need to try to figure out much more. But that's the general consensus of what the research is kind of pointing to at the moment.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And this is also kind of where physique sport throws a wrench in things, where I think we can probably agree that if someone gets into physique sport because they want to fix their body, they don't like their body, they see it, I need to be the ideal and I'll have better self-worth if I'm successful in bodybuilding, then yeah, that's just basically an expression of the same thing that others with eating disorders have, but through this competitive outlet. But there are certainly plenty of people who get into bodybuilding who do not have a history of eating disorder, you know, the other 70% of that sample. Or, you know, like for myself, I didn't see myself as I'm too skinny or I need to be more muscular. I thought, hey, this is cool, and I'm interested in the science and the practice and the experience. However, the common thread that people experience going through their anytime they diet down to the stage are things that really look like elements of anorexia, elements of binge eating, and in potentially, if it happens before they get on stage, bulimia through compensatory reduction of calories and doing more cardio, because your binge eating episode is now impacting your results on stage, and you feel you have to do something about it, and that can create a cycle. But it's interesting that in this case, there is a physiological drive, and that's something that I think needs to be acknowledged. Like if we look at the seminal Minnesota semi-starvation study that happened it was published in 1950 by Ansel Keys. These were conscientious objectors, a bunch of males who were healthy. They screened a lot of them. So they had these very psychologically and physically healthy young men who were conscientious objectors and felt they were doing something for society, not even for themselves, by participating in this research. They were starving so that others could be rehabilitated. And the findings were used to rehabilitate POWs, Holocaust survivors, etc., and learn more about human starvation. But they had they had dropouts from people binging. They had to release them from the study. They had to implement a buddy system. People were unenrolling from university classes because they couldn't focus. They were becoming chefs afterwards.
Yeah.
They were doing things like injuring themselves to get out of the study so that they could eat. And they had rapid weight regain. And many of them also lost an accurate representation of their own view of their self. They thought they were higher in body fat than their own leanness. Other than they actually were. So I guess what I'm curious about is when someone goes through the process of contest prep and gets to an extremely lean, unsustainable place where they really only have essential body fat left, what are some of the physiological drivers? Are they contributing to this? Is it all psychological, or are there interventions we need in certain situations when someone has an eating disorder where it is about changing something physiological, and how do we go about doing that?
Well, that's a tricky question, to be honest. In terms of the physiology, that's probably not my area to kind of speak on, because I haven't done any research on that. So in terms of the physiological markers, that's a tricky one to answer. We know that there are changes that go on physiologically.
Let me pitch it to you a different way. So so someone with anorexia who is at a point where their body fat is very low, and they are now people are aware of it, and they're seeking medical treatment. What are some of the first things you have to do with someone who is, let's say, they're 180 centimeters tall but only weigh 110 pounds? What's step one? Is it just CBT and we got to address the emotions, or are there some other interventions that occur?
No. With anorexia nervosa, it's a little bit different to the other ones because they're at such a dangerously low body weight that there are a whole host of physical complications that go on. So you need to first assess them, their history, what they're going, their biological markers. So whether they're having their period and things like that. And CBT is not the first approach for people with anorexia who are dangerously low body weight, who have all these hosts of physical complications. So what you would need to do there for those particular people is you would need to admit them to a kind of an inpatient hospital where the focus isn't on CBT. That might be one very small component of treatment amongst the whole multitude of other things. But the idea is then you want to refeed them. Essentially, you need to force feed them in order to get back to a weight, in order to get back these biological markers essentially working. In terms of the mechanisms of what biological markers are malfunctioning as a result of this severe starvation, I would need to read much more about this because I'm not incredibly aware of the biological markers that are going on. But my understanding of anorexia nervosa is that you need to take a multidisciplinary approach where the first priority is stabilizing their weight, getting them back to a weight it's essentially force feeding them to the point of getting things back to, I guess, some degree of normalcy. But that's a little bit, I'm wondering your opinion on what it's like from physique competitors, because they're going through the same kind of behaviors. They're restricting themselves quite a bit to attain a certain body weight. But my understanding or my opinion is that they know that there's an end point after it. So they know that once they've finished the stage, then they can start kind of putting all this nutrition back into themselves and they allow themselves to eat. Whereas people with anorexia nervosa, it's an ongoing battle. So they're doing this indefinitely without an endpoint in mind. So I'm wondering what it's like when you deal with these people who are the extreme ends of restriction, obsessive counting calories, obsessive tracking their every exercise movement and things like that. What's it like after then they finish their competition? Do they still engage in those same behaviors, or are they much more relaxed and flexible in their approach? It would be interesting to consider, because what we see with the anorexia nervosa population is they just keep going forever. And you can't, eventually what happens, unfortunately, is death, because they can't,
Yes.
they die because they can't do it. But people who have a goal in mind of stepping on stage, because I always, anecdotally, I hear friends do bodybuilding and things like that. And once they finish their contest, they then go out to get a humongous plate of food because it's their reward. Yeah. So that, I think, is a differing approach. They then allow them to reintroduce nutrition back into their lives, whereas people with anorexia nervosa don't. It's just like that forever, and that's the way that they want to live for the rest of their lives. So it'd be interesting to get both your opinions on what happens after the bodybuilding has finished, or the prep the competition has done. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and the differences among individuals gives great insight into someone's relationship with food, why they got into bodybuilding, how bodybuilding might have changed their relationship with food in their body, and whether or not bodybuilding might be a negative or a positive for them. And I think there's a big difference between 99.9% of competitors going out to have a huge burger and a shake and feeling so uncomfortable that they're borderline throwing up, and sometimes throwing up the first day, even a weekend, or even into breakfast, and then going back to an off-season diet and then being all good with it. And what often happens, and what there's entire nutritional paradigms built around, is trying to essentially stay as lean as possible after the show, while still paying some heed to the competitive goals of bodybuilding and putting on muscle. And different philosophies of bodybuilding will have you stay reasonably lean or get huge immediately, and at what speed, etc. So there's a whole camp that came out of a concept of reverse dieting. And reverse dieting is a broad spectrum term, and I don't want to throw it under the bus. There's a lot of good versions of it. We use the term recovery diet just because it's more of just trying to put the right mindset in the athlete's head, that we want them to recover post-competition. Because if you look at the physiological markers present in someone with anorexia who's lost a lot of weight and is an unhealthy weight, almost everything is shared with someone who is dieted to get to the stage level, except maybe there's no loss of lean body mass. Comparably, they're maintaining bone mineral density. But yeah, I mean, we see testosterone levels go to 1/4. We see T3, T4 drop through the floor. We see leptin tank and ghrelin skyrocket. So many of the same physiological markers occurred, probably not the same degree as there is some maintenance of a healthy diet, but still calorie restricted. So hopefully micronutrient deficiencies aren't there, no female athlete triad, etc. But often sometimes that as well. So anyway, shared physiological outcomes because both are on an extreme diet. But afterwards, yes, if someone is in the mindset of I need to recover, build muscle, improve for next season, get back up to healthy body fat percentage, that can be all good. But when someone follows like the most extreme versions of reverse diet, they're trying to essentially see how lean can I stay and still live life. And they maintain a position of restraint into the off season, and they get this push and pull because they no longer have that all-encompassing goal that helps them implement that restraint. And now the next season is at least a year off. And that's when it starts looking a lot more like bulimia. And you'll have them, right, I was dieting on 2,000 calories, so now I'm going to go to 2,200 calories and just cut out one cardio session. And I can maintain that for 4 days, and then I have a blowout. Well, then I've got to diet that off and then go back to 2,200 calories.
Yeah.
And so it can very easily turn into that, and it turns into that quite commonly. And that tells you something about, in my opinion, why the person got into the sport, or how their relationship with their body changed. Maybe bodybuilding became too important during that process, and the look of being a bodybuilder gave them a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of self-worth. And if I'm going to still have that, I got to still look like a bodybuilder or some semblance of it. And I think that's where it's really important to emphasize that, yeah, that is just the time-restricted goal. Yes, you should be getting back up to healthy body fat. No, being shredded is not conducive to putting on muscle mass. That is where I think education does come into play. And I think that's where discussing some of the aspects of what is actual flexible restraint versus, rigid restraint. What is internal cues, external cues, and what is a healthy relationship with food in your body, and what might that look like in the context of someone who competes?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what you've described there is that people go through after their competition, they go through episodes of binge eating, purging, restriction, and things like that. So, and I think it just boils down to the fact of how they're kind of the importance that they're placing on their body weight and their body
Hmm.
shape. So without that, so if people are able to, after their show, then evaluate who they are as a person on all of those different life domains, then what we usually see is that they don't adopt these really inflexible practices, and they don't go through the cycle of binge eating, purging. So I think it's and Eric, you've been doing an excellent job in kind of trying to prescribe or promote healthier alternatives to bodybuilding after people have finished the prep. So what are the different styles of eating people can adopt after they've finished a particular contest or something like that? So then the question becomes, so what are the options? So what kind of options do we have after we finish our competition? So you've mentioned a couple of things, the flexible approach to dieting, which is I just want to ask you a question. Is the flexible approach, is that the same thing as if it fits your macros?
People seem to think so, brother. But
So it's
I
okay.
think it would actually be really helpful if you could talk, because flexible dieting, whether people know it or not, did actually come out of the Westenhofer's group of saying, hey, there's two different types of
Yeah.
restraint, which has been kind of questioned lately. But I think it'd be really helpful if you could talk us through what is restraint. Obviously, I think we all understand that word, and we know that a bodybuilder has to exert restraint to get to
Yeah.
the kind of condition they have to. If they just followed their natural eating signals, they'd probably lose 5 to 10 pounds and then just gain it right back, just like most people, right? So if a bodybuilder must exert restraint, what different types of restraint are there, and how different are they? And what because you can kind of tell us what the roots of this flexible dieting movement are, and whether or not someone who just simply tracks their macros is actually flexible dieting, or do they just think they are in some cases?
Right. Yeah. The reason why I just asked that, because I wasn't sure whether if it fits your macros was used synonymously with flexible restraint in kind of your field.
So
And it
it
seems like it
is,
was.
and
Yeah.
my champion fight for the last 5 years has been to change that.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah.
so you are now going to be my propped up propaganda puppet to
Right.
show the science behind that as well.
The
So,
real intention behind this episode is made clear.
yes,
Right. Right.
be
So,
my mouthpiece. Yeah.
so when we're talking about restraint, we can define restraint as the conscious attempt to restrict food intake with the goal of regulating body weight to some extent, whether that's putting on weight, losing weight, or maintaining weight. The goal is to consciously restrict food intake. But we in the literature we saw a bunch of different inconsistencies. So there are heaps of studies that shown that restraint was problematic in that it led to a variety of complications. So not only disordered eating symptoms, but also cognitive deficits and also even weight gain or weight regain. But then there are other studies that found the opposite direction, the opposite pattern. So then in the 90s, it was proposed that restraint isn't a unitary construct. We can distinguish between two types of dietary restraint. One being a more rigid approach to dieting, which is what we see in an all or none approach to eating, dieting, and weight, essentially, where people have these inflexible diet rules that essentially dictate what, when, and how much they eat. So when people follow that they must never eat carbohydrates forever, where they have these other rules that they go for long periods of time fasting, 6 hours, 6 waking hours a day. They won't eat anything because they have this belief that they will speed up weight loss. So rigid dietary restraint is that all or none approach to dieting, where they have these multitude of diet rules that govern their eating behavior. It's a little bit different to flexible dieting or flexible dietary restraint, which is a much more graded approach to eating. So it's defined by a bunch of behaviors, by things such as things like people still pay attention to their figure, but they allow themselves to eat in moderation a wide variety of foods. If they felt like they've eaten too much at one meal, they might compensate a little bit at the next meal by choosing to opt for a little bit less or healthier options. But essentially the idea is that it's a much more relaxed approach to eating. So in the literature, they initially documented kind of different relationships. So they found that rigid dieting was associated with a bunch of negative outcomes. So disordered eating, binge eating, body image concerns, and even weight regain. Whereas flexible dieting was the healthier approach to eating. It was associated with less disordered eating, better cognitive performance, and even more sustained weight loss. But it wasn't until recently that the relationships have become muddled again. So we haven't found those consistent different associations. And it was a bit unclear as to why that was happening. So it wasn't until, I guess, very recently where people tried to tease this apart. They were just like, okay, what is it? Is there such thing as flexible dieting and rigid dieting? Do the two exist? So what we've found is that consistently the two approaches are highly related to each other, meaning that people who are high in rigid dieting are also generally higher in flexible dieting as well, which doesn't really make sense the way that we think about it, because we think about it as a dichotomy. People fall into one camp or the other, but it's actually not the case. But my kind of hypothesis is that we have a measurement issue going on. We just don't know how to measure flexible restraint at the moment. I do think that it's something that does exist and it's something that it's helpful, but we just don't know how to measure it because we've only got one measurement tool for flexible restraint at the moment. And that was actually developed post hoc. It wasn't developed with the intention of measuring flexible restraint. But what we actually find is that if we kind of compare the two directly, compare flexible and rigid restraint, and we separate them out, so we control for each of them. So what that means is we study the only unique properties of each component of restraint. So we partial out the commonalities among the two. What we do find is that flexible restraint is associated relatively consistently with good outcomes. They're associated with less binge eating, less body image concerns, and things like that. But that only happens when we partial it out, when we control for the rigid component, when we completely isolate flexible restraint independent of rigid restraint. So that's suggesting a couple of things. It's suggesting that, one, we have evidence that flexible restraint is good. It's a good thing. So even though people are still paying attention to their figure and they're still allowing themselves to eat a variety of foods, that actually is a much more healthier approach to eating than the rigid component or the rigid approach. The second thing is we need to come up with ways in which we can measure this better, because the current measurement tool we have, so at the moment, there's only one self-report questionnaire that exists to measure flexible and rigid restraint. What we need to do is come up with something better that completely isolates flexible restraint, that's independent of rigid restraint. And then that might clarify all of these inconsistencies in the literature. And it might then kind of indicate, it might give us a better idea, or it might allow us to draw much firmer conclusions of prescribing or recommending flexible restraint. So my kind of conclusion from these two components is that there's no doubt that flexible restraint is much more safer than a rigid restraint, but whether it's safe in and of itself is another question that we need to continue to kind of touch on later on down the track. And I'm sure that that's based on your kind of experience with working with clients, I'm wondering whether that's kind of the approach, the thoughts that you have as well, is that we know that flexible is better than rigid, but we need to kind of still understand it a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between principles and rules, right? So if you have some basic principles and then rules emerge from them, or rules help you follow those principles, when the rule starts to subvert the principle, that's when the rule is not helpful or counter to the principle or goal, right? And I think you can see this all the time in quote unquote flexible dieting communities and bodybuilding and fitness, where they'll read or hear or be told, hey, you want to have a flexible, approach with healthy with your food and be moderate. And for that reason, no food is off the table. We just need to moderate portion sizes and etc. And then the actual rule is I will hit 255 grams of carbs every day. And if I'm over, I'm a bad person and I might as well eat a large pizza, which is essentially rigid restraint. The method is slightly different. You don't have a meal plan, you have a macro plan, but the perception and the underlying principle is basically the same. I have a rigid rule and I've got to do it.
Yeah.
Looking at the research, there's a paper by, I think it's pronounced Palasha et al., 2015.
Yes.
Yeah, you probably know the one I'm talking about, where they specifically just looked at black and white thinking and dichotomous thinking, instead of looking at saying, hey, that's a characteristics of rigid control, saying, hey, how does that independently fare? And it was related to weight regain. It was a mediator for weight regain, which makes a lot of sense to me. I think we could probably look at two components. First is, how much does someone evaluate their weight and shape? So why are they restraining? And then the second piece is if we can get away from some of the methods, because someone can just get exposed to the right influencer and they might track macros but still have a very overall rigid approach.
Black and white view,
yeah. So why does someone restrain? And then if we isolate the element of black and white thinking, so if those two variables, I think, were emphasized in maybe a multivariate model, I think we'd start to see a difference. And that's typically, as a coach, what I emphasize. Like, hey, we can create all these different kind of methods and individualize that and customize it to you. But the big picture takeaway is we don't have this dichotomous view of food or eating. And the reason why we're doing this is really important. Like, do you think that by getting abs, you're going to be happy? Or do you think you don't have value or worth unless you're a good bodybuilder? Do you have those other ways of assessing yourself? So I think that's typically what results in success from me and what is associated with people who adopt a long-term flexible approach. And I think that those aspects aren't uncovered in those two components of restraint in the way they are currently, which makes sense to me why they would have so much shared variance.
That's right. And that should ring a bell, Eric. I'll preface this, Omar, by saying Eric and I are working on a research paper at the moment that's looking at these kind of restraint styles, both behaviors and cognitions. And we found that that this black and white thinking, when we controlled for everything, that was the thing that was driving or associated most strongly with the psychopathology that we see. So it directly comes back to your point that it's the kind of the belief system that people have that is probably the thing that is causing the most harm. I say causing very loosely there. That is driving the most harm there. So what that means is kind of coaches in your sphere is that we want to make sure that we prescribe these guidelines that people have, but don't then take them onto rules, because once they turn into rules, then people would, as soon as they kind of break that rule, then that all hell breaks loose there. So trying to take a more balanced approach where there's a bit of gray area. If they go over their recommended guideline, then that's okay. Then it doesn't mean that things are going to go all wrong. So I think targeting or addressing the dichotomous thinking would play a huge role as coaches in your sphere, and also people as eating disorder eating disorder researchers and clinicians as well. I honestly think that the dichotomous thinking is the key factor that is differentiating between the two components of the restraint. But at the moment, the measurement tools that we have don't really tap into those dichotomous thinking tendencies all too well. So it's probably a direction for future work to really isolate those two measures of restraint by using dichotomous thinking as a starting point for how to diverge the two.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, I wanted to leave it to you if you wanted to talk about the paper. It's still in review. But yeah, I'm excited about that. I think the discussion is really, really cool in that as it is. We'll see what the peer reviewers think, obviously. But yeah, I totally agree. And I think that is a big difference, understanding the difference between the way someone views food and their relationship with it and what methods they use. And that typically is lost when you get into the if it fits your macros equals flexible dieting kind of can't. So yeah, I guess I want to kind of make one interesting statistical point about why it's so difficult for us to tease all this out, is that when we're looking at all these complex variables, and we are looking at essentially associations and correlation versus causation, and even when we do talk about causation, the type of causation we're talking about is a contributory cause, so enhancing a risk factor significantly more than another condition versus the sole cause, is that the reason why when we looked at previous studies on restraint or even types of restraint, why sometimes the direction of causality will like flip-flop, like, oh wait, is restraint causing weight loss, or are people who are gaining weight have higher restraint, is because we can't tell in that relationship. So for the audience, if you think about it, you might have heard some headlines saying, hey, diet soda is linked with obesity. Well, if you think about it, hold on, is it that when you look at a relationship, is it all these people with obesity drinking diet soda, is that making them obese? Or is it because they're thinking, I don't want to be obese, I'm going to grab the diet soda? Likewise, if someone is higher in body weight and is not pleased with that, might they not do a crash diet? And then when they're tested in a study, score higher for rigid restraint. And that's why when you have to do a relatively complex model, use a multivariate approach to tease that out, to prevent these the unknown directionality of correlations, and really kind of do the good work that Dr. Linardon here is doing. So just a kind of a minor clarifying point there on the methods.
Absolutely, and it's always difficult. The designs of these studies, it's so expensive to run these longitudinal studies for multiple years. So we kind of have to use our next best approach by looking at statistical correlations first, and then that will inform the more expensive stuff down the track. Yeah, so absolutely take your point there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's all these things that come from the next thing is kind of what I've seen. You know, like with eating disorders, it starts with, do you have an over-evaluation of, you know, your shape or your body as being core defining characteristics of your intrinsic self-worth? Then that can therefore lead to a disordered eating pattern, which leads to a rigid form of restraint, which then creates this cyclical pattern. And then emerging out of those, that restraint are the things you have to do to see if the restraint is working. And this is kind of what I call like the methods. This is assessing your physique in the mirror, right? As a bodybuilder, something you do. This is stepping on the scale to make sure that you were in a deficit and you're losing weight week to week. And this is tracking your food to make sure that the calories you're taking don't go over whatever limit or target you have. And now there's lines of research that suggest that these might fall into that category of maintaining behaviors in some cases among those eating disorders. So can you talk a little bit about monitoring behaviors, both of one's physique and weight, and then calories and food?
Yeah, right. So self-monitoring of these kind of body image and eating behaviors is what we consider to be an expression of the overvaluation of weight and shape. So if we think about it, people who judge their self-worth almost entirely on their body weight and shape, what do they do about that? So we know, we've already talked about that they go on to diet, they go into these inflexible diets, but they also do a couple of other things. They obsessively check their body. So that can come in the form of many things. So stepping on the scales multiple times a day, just to see what their fluctuations in their body weight have been. Or they just stare at themselves in the mirror many times a day, just kind of assessing all the different parts of their body to see what they like, what they don't like. Or they make comparisons with other people. So there are a bunch of different body checking behaviors that stem from this overvaluation of weight and shape. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. The first reason why it's a problem is that it just adds fuel to the fire. It just fuels that overvaluation even further, and then even further exacerbates that rigid dietary approach. The second reason why is it directly causes the rigid approach to eating, in that if we think about it anecdotally for a second, someone who is on a strict diet, right, or they overvalue their body weight and shape, they step on the scales, and there are either three outcomes on the scale. The first one is that they lose weight. The second one is that they put on weight, or the third one is that they stay completely the same. There's only three outcomes from jumping on the scale. But interestingly, although there are three outcomes, the conclusion or the belief will stay exactly the same. So let's think about it. So someone who loses weight, they really place a lot of importance on their weight and shape. They lose weight. That's a good thing to that person. So their conclusion is it's working. I'm going to diet the same extent, or I'm going to still diet as hard as I was doing earlier because what I'm doing is working at the moment. So the conclusion is I must diet harder. What about the other outcome where they put on weight? Well, that's a bad thing to this person because they're striving for weight loss. So their conclusion is, well, what I've done previously hasn't been working. So as a result, I'm going to have to even try even harder now to diet to lose that weight that I just put on. So the conclusion again is that I must try harder. And the same thing happens for the person who maintains their weight because they probably, in most cases, they want to lose weight. If they haven't lost anything, they're still disappointed. So their ultimate conclusion again is that they want to diet harder. So body checking is a problem because it just fuels that rigid approach to eating. It's a bad thing. But then there are also people who avoid their body as well. So what we call body image avoidance, which is essentially defined by behaviors such as things that people that will never jump on the scales, they will wear really baggy clothes to hide any kind of any parts of their figure.
Tobias the Never Nude from Arrested Development.
I'm not familiar. Yep. Actually, I watched an episode of that last night, but I didn't like it.
Basically, the guy never will remove his jean shorts, no matter what, even during sex or anything. He will always keep his jean shorts on, will shower in them, and he'll never remove them.
Yeah.
Why?
Why are you asking?
Because that would be his response. Arrested Development classic. But you actually see the big baggy like track pants and in the off season among bodybuilders and yep.
I find it interesting that both of you guys are wearing big baggy clothing, talking about. Meanwhile, I'm ready. I'm like, hey, we're taking these tops off, boys, or what's going on here?
Yeah, it might just be that we're in the southern hemisphere and it's the winter, but probably we have issues with body weight checking and hiding. Yeah.
So that's also an issue as well, because what happens is it doesn't allow us to disconfirm our negative beliefs that we have about our weight and shape. So both the obsessive body checking and the frequent body avoidance both contribute to the maintenance of eating disorder symptoms via those mechanisms that I just talked about there. So the idea is that we need to try to find some sort of happy medium, but what that happy medium is kind of there's still much more to be kind of explored towards understanding what the happy medium is. For people with severe eating disorders, the happy medium that we've kind of agreed on at the moment is supervised and regular once weekly weighing, self-weighing with a supervised therapist. The idea is the therapist helps the person interpret what the numbers on the scale means without resorting to those harmful dietary practices. But in terms of the general population, what that happy medium is, we're not entirely clear just yet. So it could be in the form of just simply educating about social comparisons, about, how it's harmful to perhaps always scrutinize your own body to really to the nth extent relative to someone you see on Instagram who you see for 1 second and then conclude that their figure is so great. Mm-hmm. So we're not entirely clear what that is, but all we know is that both kind of forms of checking or self-monitoring are problematic, and they contribute to not only the body image concerns that are stemming the whole cycle, but also the rigid dietary behaviors or the unhealthy weight control behaviors that we see as well. So the conclusion is that we must, if we're talking in your domains, the physique competitors, we must pay attention to this obsessiveness. We must find a way to kind of make it less obsessive to some extent, particularly in the off season when people have finished their competition. It's probably not going to be helpful for them to just always stare at their body when they are going through a period of eating at maintenance, for example, when they're probably going to put on a couple kilos from when they were relative to when they were on stage, for example. So it might just be it's a discussion point to talk about how we could kind of find better ways to monitor these people, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have an entire paper that's in peer review that is attempting to provide some guidance on that. It's obviously in its infancy, but I think the point I want to make, and then I think we can probably close out because we've come full circle, is that when you decide to be a competitive physique athlete, there is an obligatory participation in many of the behaviors that we know are risk factors for eating disorders.
Yeah.
So the comparison is the sport. Comparing your physique against others on stage, and getting a trophy truly based on how you compare to others and how you meet some idealized standard. Even if you are someone who hasn't bought into the idea of this is what I should look like for my self-worth, but I'm doing it for a sport, that's present. You also have to ensure, if you're not assessing, you're guessing. This is, sport and fitness. You wouldn't go through you wouldn't be an S&C coach for a football team and not assess whether someone's 40 times were improving or whether they were catching, less interceptions or more interceptions or throwing better or throwing a 90 mile-per-hour fastball. So you're going to have to assess, is my deficit successful? Is my physique improving? I'm going to take regular pictures, measurements, step on the scale. And if I want to do that accurately, I might use, an average of 3 to 7 weigh-ins per week, which might mean up to daily weigh-ins, which we know is associated with poor outcomes and higher stress. And I'm going to create this physiological drive that mimics anorexia, and which will prompt binge eating, which is actually part of the post-competition process. Everyone is expected to engage in binge eating afterwards. Which is not truly a binge eating episode because you're in control, you're deciding to, although it typically goes further than you expect. So you can expect to experience a binge eating episode. You can expect to experience all the physiological effects of anorexia, and you are participating in all the behaviors that are associated with increased risk factors for eating disorders. So that's quite the recipe for disaster. So I think it's one of those places where you have to have informed consent. And I think that's my main goal, is that I want people to know what they're getting into, what modern competitive bodybuilding is. And I do not think it's inherently harmful, but I think you are at a greater risk, just like if you decide to play rugby or American football, you're at a greater risk of traumatic brain injury, and the symptoms associated with that, or just tearing your ACL. So I think it's really, really useful that we've got people like yourself, Jake, who are you're a pure researcher within the eating disorder sphere, and taking this multidisciplinary approach and being able to work with myself, and being able to kind of combine our knowledge spaces to hopefully help people, I think is really valuable. And the fact that you're also out there and you're putting out information to the public, not just within the peer-reviewed research, I think is really valuable. So Omar, anything else that you want to touch on before we learn more about where we can find out more information from Jake?
A lot, actually. I've been sitting back
here. Kick it off, brother.
Just observing. And first, I am going to call you out in turn, Eric. One, how dare you? Because now that
Damn right.
Yeah, because now that I've heard everything that you say publicly to individuals when it comes to restraint, flexible restraint, best practices, the holistic approach, getting into it for the right reasons. Jake, I don't know if you know this, Eric's my coach, and so I sent him in.
Did you eat the pound of celery this week?
So I sent him in the physique photos, and his response was, just understand you'll never be good enough, was his opening line. And then
start with shame to get the motivator.
Yeah, you'll never be good enough, exclamation point. And then he told me something about a cabbage soup diet, and that if you don't see your ribs by the 3rd week, find a new coach. So it's interesting how sometimes coaches have a difference between theory and practice. I suppose that's just how he individually treats certain athletes. Anyways, I just thought that was an interesting observation. I don't know if you want to respond, Eric, before I go on.
Well, the main thing was I found you just did not place enough of your self-worth on your body.
Right.
Like, for someone to allow themselves to have those kind of calves, we just got to reprogram you, you know? So first step is make you feel that the only way towards self-worth and also acceptance from your coach is by making your body better, and then letting you know it's never good enough, so you keep instituting progressive overload.
Right. Progressive overload of shame.
And then once that shame reaches a level that it's high enough, then you're more likely to be able to sustain that cabbage soup diet, because there is a lot of body fat to lose.
There is a lot. We're getting you just down to Omar, you're going to be clinical. I also it's been a very interesting conversation. I do just have one or two questions for Jake. Dealing primarily more with, let's say, strength athletes over the last little bit. It's so interesting to hear some of the stuff, just some of the research, because for a powerlifter who's not a weight class restricted powerlifter, so let's say the classic powerlifter, where they ask
Super
you,
heavy.
yeah, what should I eat, bro? And the answer is just yes. To have this perspective, and almost it's maybe they're Eric counterculture because they're not conforming to any body types, traditional body types. But I've seen,
Amen.
yeah, the conversation when we said the greater conversation about media and our role as so-called in quotations influencers or communicators or participants in the social media stratosphere would be that I've seen positives and negatives, and maybe some of the goals or the onus on us is to emphasize the positive signals and try and de-emphasize the negative ones, where I've seen both. So there's two movements related to the female lifters and female lifting enthusiasts. Would be one, the slim thick movement that came out over the last handful of years, which is the traditional body images that you have to be skinny, you have to be a certain amount of weight, like the model the model physique where you have to be a certain weight. And then almost in contrast to that, it seemingly was a little bit grassroots, where women took it upon themselves that didn't fit that traditional body type to embrace themselves and embrace their curves, as they call it, and embrace a higher body fat percentage. And so, once again, does that place pressure now on women for another pedestal where, like, now you have to have, a ginormous booty or this and that, perhaps. But some of the more problematic points of, constantly being in caloric restriction if you wanted to be rail thin and look like a model, or the necessity to have one exact body type for everyone, I think was something positive from social media. So I once again am slightly cynical, so some of the things I say about media or consumer culture could come across as negative, but I think that's one thing, one of the positives I've seen. But then one of the negatives, talking about the reward mechanisms, maybe by the algorithms, would be the prevalence I've seen, Jake, of calorie challenges and the popularity both amongst males and females on YouTube of competitive eaters that eat 20-30,000 calories, and this is seen as a major accomplishment. But then also the glorification of tiny women, so i.e. Fitness influencers eating absurd amount of calories and still being lean, and how those videos in comparison, so you look at whatever, let's say Eric puts out a video on what we just talked about, how many views we'll get, and then tiny girl, like fit chick versus 10,000 calories, will get 4 million views, so just how that it's a cycle. I guess one of my questions for you, Jake, would be, as consumers, as participants in social media, maybe what are some of the best practices for trying to enable a healthier body image with individuals in society? Like, what are the research, or what does it say?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I have seen those challenges of the eating challenges. They're actually quite entertaining to watch sometimes, because I always think how they can get this down. They eventually always almost get them down. But in terms of what can you do, I think the biggest thing is just being more aware, or being more educated about the kind of pitfalls, the potential harms and advantages of social media. Because a lot of the times we're talking about people who lack perhaps the basic knowledge of the media impact, and they're kind of passive participants in social media and things like that. So here I'm talking about perhaps even secondary school children, where they haven't been aware of or exposed to these potential harms or pitfalls of social media. So I think being able to become more knowledgeable or aware of social media and how it works and how it operates, particularly the fact that social media is more of a highlight reel of someone's life rather than the everyday struggles that people go through. Essentially, you're not going to post the something on social media where you feel like you look incredibly bad or something like that. So just being more aware or educated about social media and its functions and what purpose it serves. Because there's a good deal of evidence showing that once we're aware of this, we're then able to better challenge those negative kind of images or stereotypes as well, and we're better able to foster the positive or take on board the positive components of social media as well. So that stems down to education. And the second one, it's a very simple one, but it's shown to be effective, is being selective of who you are or not going to follow on social media. So if you feel like you're following someone who is making you feel pretty crappy about yourself, even though you're really interested in this person's life, there's been some evidence showing that simply unfollowing them has a positive impact on someone's body image or esteem. So although it's a simple kind of method or strategy, it actually can be quite a potent one, and it can have relatively short-term benefits to a person's kind of psyche as well. So I think through evidence, they're the two major strategies someone could adopt towards kind of taking on social media or media in general, and then applying that to their kind of everyday life. But again, it's just something that science is pretty boring in that the answer is always going to be, oh, we need to devote more attention to this, or we need to study it a little bit further. It's a really boring answer, and I hate saying it. But if I were not to say that, then I reckon I'd be doing a disservice and almost kind of, promoting something that is not as conclusive as what we would like to know, if that makes sense. So I think they're the main things to take out of that.
I do want to challenge you, Jake, because when you said science is boring, have you ever seen the movie or show Weird Science?
No, I haven't.
Classic.
Google
Classic.
it. Now, I don't mean to objectify either woman in it, but wow, I'm motivated to learn after watching either of those. So, is science boring? Up for debate. Last question, because I remember you prefaced this podcast episode where I think some of your current research is taking a look into the role of technology with disordered eating. Is there anything that you want to comment about that, emerging technology, best practices with disordered eating?
Yeah, right. So with technology, so we know that I've done a recent paper on the role of smartphone apps in kind of mental health problems and including disordered eating. And we've actually found some really positive results in that people who use smartphone apps designed for these mental health issues generally have a positive impact on their mental health problems. So things like depression, anxiety, and also their eating behavior and body image. So these mental health apps are freely available, or if they're not free, they're like a couple of bucks or something. So people who are struggling to kind of identify a therapist or find a therapist to speak about their issues may benefit from using these simple, cheap, and effective apps. So I think it's really important to emphasize that technology certainly plays a role in mental health, and people who don't have access to treatment can perhaps benefit from these technology-based interventions, particularly for people who are early in the problem. So particularly who have just recently started to experience any issues, technology may be the best approach for them because it would save them a considerable amount of money. But for those who are really ingrained and have been dealing with these issues for many, many years, then it's probably the evidence is showing at the moment that you'd probably need much more intensive face-to-face kind of treatment for those who have been battling for quite a long time. So it's just kind of for people who are weighing up whether or not they should kind of look at the internet for resources and look at their mobile phone for self-help resources. Just get a feel for what kind of works for them. Do they feel like they need to kind of let loose at a therapist, just talk about all of these things? Or do they feel like they have the competency to deal with their things on their own? So it's a case-by-case basis, but I certainly recommend for people to check out all of these different resources out there on the internet and online, because it could be something that really helps them as well. But Yeah, as I mentioned, it's a bit of a case by case basis, and someone just needs to really look deep within themselves and kind of understand, well, what is it that I really need to kind of get my eating behavior back in track or in control again?
Introspection, that requires too much work. You know, it doesn't require work? A whole pizza, because it's delicious. Eric, I just this just in. We got everything. Okay, that was the last question. Wanted to make sure we got everything for our upcoming course that Eric and myself are going to be hosting. How to cure binge eating once and for all. Price point TBD. We're going to find the highest possible price point, and pry upon their emotional weakness to charge as much as possible to emphasize the value of the product. So, Jake, it's just been fantastic having you on. Help us refine the product. You were probably wondering, you're like, wow, Eric's questions and points were just impeccable. It's my man's doing research, okay?
That's it. 100% agree.
So yeah, we just want to thank everyone who's now a certified binge eating destroyer. You know, well done for your course. And if you want to learn more about breaking binge eating, where can people find you, Jake?
Thanks for that. I just want to say again, thanks for having me on. It's been a real honor to speak to you guys on these issues. Like, you're both humongous in your space in terms of the amount of people that listen to your stuff. So it's a great privilege to speak. So I thank you once again.
Please don't try and out humble Eric Helms. It will not work. It's a losing battle.
No, Jake did a great job. I think he's definitely more humble than I
am. So if you're interested in the stuff that I kind of do, I've got a website available that provides a bunch of different self-help resources and articles and research opportunities, and that's just breakbingeeating.com, and also on Instagram as well. I've recently started an Instagram which is getting a bit of attention, which is nice at the moment, where I just post a bunch of things related to these topics that we've all spoke about today, and that's just at Break Binge Eating on Instagram. So give us a follow if you're interested in this kind of information, and that's where all kind of my information goes out, and I try to disseminate as much as possible towards the community via those two platforms there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jake. We really appreciate your time.
No, thank you again. Yeah.
Jake, honestly, it's been fantastic having you on. I appreciate all the insight that you provided. I think we really talked thoroughly on this topic. I think there are numerous takeaways for everyone listening, even if you've never found yourself in that situation of disordered eating, just perhaps helping out someone else who you might know is going through this, or you see some of those symptoms and signs. A little can go a long way. I want to thank everyone who has been listening to Iron Culture, the podcast. History, science, culture. It's how we do it. New episodes every single Monday with myself and the one and only Eric Helms. You can leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. You can also give a thumbs up if you're on YouTube, or a thumbs down if that's how you feel. That's okay. You leave a comment. We will do our best to respond. Everything that Jake once again mentioned will be linked in the description for those curious, and we'll catch everyone in that next episode on Monday.